Hello and welcome back to Introduction to International Relations. This now is the sixth session, and for this presentation I will be focusing in on Marxism and critical theory. Critical theory and Marxism have connections, i.e. Karl Marx and Immanuel Kant and other thinkers have had an influence on critical theory, but I differentiate between them, as you will see shortly, the reasons why and so on and so forth. But this now is taking us more in a direction in terms of international relations theory in a more critical direction. The clue's in the title of critical theory. And so without further ado, as I often like to say, here is the first slide. And again, I have an image for you to think about. This is not an art history class per se, but it's an image for you to think about, to interpret, etc., to give some historical, social context, which just takes us nicely to Marxism and or critical theory. What do you see in this first image? Well, I imagine you give a whole host of answers, but you can see a whole what seems like, at least, what's represented as workers going on a demonstration in a particular city, quite possibly. And as you can see, the caption, "Capitalism isn't working." And you see a whole host of people on the dole queue, i.e. unemployment office. So workers, the representation, the relationship between workers and employers, or the capital. So those who own the capital and the workers, and the relationship between the two, and the tensions and the inequalities. And key to this image, and this is where both Marxism, but also in particular critical theory that I'll put an emphasis on in the latter part of the presentation, another world is possible. Another world is possible. Now, there are critiques of Marxism and critiques also, let's say, of the horrors of what took place in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, etc., etc. Nonetheless, and forgive this idiom, one should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Karl Marx's great contribution was not that necessarily he envisaged a perfect ideal society coming forward. He was vague about what communism would eventually look like. His great contribution in Das Kapital, arguably, is his understanding, examination, and interpretation of capitalism. Indeed, even if one, let's say, looks, you can see articles in The Economist or Financial Times being critical of Karl Marx as a thinker, because it's against the liberal global order, but actually understanding his great sophistication as a thinker, his dialectical approach, understanding how material and ideational factors link, which I'm going to go into, and understanding what capitalism types of order it produces, reproduces, and why this is the case. So his major contribution, that's why I want to put an emphasis on Karl Marx early on in the presentation. And later on, we'll be looking at critical theory. And again, I will refer, of course, all of this to international relations. That's my focus for obviously this presentation and this module and so on, and looking at this relationship between not just economics but also cultural factors, social cultural factors, and the relationship. So in Marxist language, the base being about how economics determine things in the world, and the superstructure, Karl Marx's language, where you have the legal, cultural, social, political order. And critical theorists try to put more of an emphasis, as did young Marx, between the two, that it's not economics that determine everything. Why has capitalism continued to be successful in the 20th, 21st century, at least as a system that it works socioeconomically? Maybe it doesn't benefit a lot of people and there's great inequality, but it still is the status quo. And critical theorists therefore need to bring in cultural and social factors of how people are socialized to believe in a particular system, and this notion of hegemony, which Gramsci talks about, and I will be talking about more with Robert W. Cox, why let's say the social order has gone a particular way, where it's going, and how critically can we think about it, engage with it, and possibly change it for the better. And that's where critical theory comes in, and critiques also some of the more mainstream theories that we've already come across, i.e. realism and liberalism in particular, critiques them and says that they are just representing the status quo. We need to be much more critical, radical about it, try to understand why things are the way they are, and not just in a sense try to let's say, modify it slightly, but there needs to be a clear difference and change in terms of how the world works. Why is there poverty in the world? Why is there suffering and injustice? And this is what critical theory tries to address, as does, of course, Marxist thinking, as do all the other theories, but the focus today is on these two. So this is the outline of the lecture today. I'm going to give an overview of Karl Marx. I won't be going into Karl Marx, born and lived between 1818 and 1883, his very interesting life story, and so on and so forth. I'm going to zone in particularly on how it relates to IR and structural Marxism. Immanuel Wallerstein, who will be coming across later on in this presentation, a very important thinker from the late 1960s onwards, how there's hierarchy and between rich countries, in between, and poor countries, and why this is the case. So a more structuralist approach, remember structure and agency, from constructivism, and critical theory. Again, this relationship between the superstructure and their base, which I'll talk about, and how it's possible to change institutions, reform them, or possibly change them in a progressive or emancipatory way. I will go into more detail as we go through. So, assumptions of Marxism. So within, and I'm going to zone this in, and again from the readings that you've had and so on, like Mark Rupert's readings in international relations theories, discipline and diversity, we have to see differences between a Marxist approach and IR theory, and that's why I focused in on Marxism rather than Karl Marx himself, because this is not so much a political philosophy or political theory presentation or module right now. But actually, if you look at the liberal view, as I went on about with liberalism, liberal institutionalism before, and I referred, of course, to Adam Smith, one could refer to John Locke, previous English thinker of the 17th century, the social contract and self-interested, Adam Smith in the 18th century, liberal thinkers in the 19th century like John Stuart Mill, 20th, 21st century. It's all about the self-interested individuals. And the same with mainstream economics. It's about self-interested individuals or individual entities trying to achieve certain outcomes. Realists, and they, as you know, emphasize this notion of anarchical system, no supranational authority. We need to protect ourselves, we need to survive, and sovereignty, the autonomy of the state. According to a Marxist approach and critical theory, which I go into more detail later, this is very limiting and limited. And this belief systems, so it's not constructivism here, but here we can see, at least with critical theory and this dialectical relationship we look at, these belief systems have also produced a particular order that the people are comfortable with, or represents the status quo. And we have to look, and this is Karl Marx's great contribution, arguably, Das Kapital, etc. His focus is on a critical interpretation of capitalism. Capitalism, and now we go back, of course, to the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, the Industrial Revolution in England, the United Kingdom, and how England became a great power alongside the French and French Revolution, but this dual revolution that the great historian Eric Hobsbawm writes about how capitalism, yes, and Marx himself in that sometimes is critiqued by post-colonialists, because capitalism is very powerful, it spreads all parts of the world, and this is where Marx is critiqued by some post-colonial thinkers, is that it can help developing countries, it can spread on and so on and so forth. Those who have used Marx's work today and critical theorists critique that and say, actually, capitalism, yes, it has some powerful elements to it. It's dynamic. So Karl Marx was not an anti-capitalist for the sake of being an anti-capitalist. He could see some of the benefits, that it was dynamic, that it evolved, and that's why it was powerful and continued to be. However, it was a particular historical context where it came into being. And of course, the Industrial Revolution from England, the UK contributed to it. But also it reproduced and produced and reproduced great inequality, great suffering, and particularly the classes between the proletariat and the owners of capital and the workers often making a wage, trying to live their lives, but struggling. And this inequality that's created from capitalism. And capitalism is inherently unstable, according to Marx and Marxist thinkers that come later. Why? Because it inherently creates this need for growth, and this need, here you can get into post-growth and other degrowth approaches in economy and global economy, so critiquing neoclassical economics, but it's emphasizing a particular mode of governance. And hence, when you look at great inequality in the world, and not even between developed and developing countries, but even within a society, capitalism, from a Marxist point of view, is arguably a part of the problem rather than the solution, ultimately. But again, here, and this is important philosophically, well, this is at least as important, not just the political views themselves, it's this relational process aspect, which is also an aspect of constructivism. Although, as I said, with constructivism, it's agnostic. It could be conservative, it could be liberal, it could be left-leaning. It's just this social ontology, social meaning that constructivism has, that it's a process, constant practice, interaction. And again, you can see here perhaps a connection, and this is where I'll be going into more detailed critical theory, but these agents are trying to make a living from, let's say, nature, and they're socializing with others, and this interaction. They are remaking themselves and the world. But again, contra realism or liberalism. So liberalism, the self-interested individual entity, the agent, that's limited and limiting, and also realism about power politics, sovereignty, and so on and so forth. These are limited and limiting assumptions according to a Marxist approach. Now, this dialectical, we're constantly interacting and so on and so forth. So Karl Marx as a figure, human beings are seen as the producers and products of historical processes. And this is a very, very important insight in the structure agency question of the social, economic, political forces that shape our lives, and agency, what possibilities to follow our objectives, and how we make and remake the structure. This is, I mean, great sociologists of the late 20th century like Tony Giddens and Roy Bashka have taken some into the structure agency question further forward. But Karl Marx, this quotations are very, very interesting of the structure versus agency. This is a young Marx when he looked more at the dialectics. Later on in his career, in his scholarship, he looks more about how economics, the base, determines things. But early on, this is a very, very insightful quotation there, I say. So I'm going to read it for you. From the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, third Bonaparte of France, the emperor. And this is the time period when Karl Marx was writing the 1848 revolutions and so on and so forth. So without further ado, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So think about that. Men and feminist thinking, it's not just men, women, humankind, etc., etc., but they don't make it as they please. So although you say that we have agency, we have some choice and we want to make things, okay? Yes, there is some agency. On the other hand, there are circumstances, structural factors, and of course it depends on how powerful or weak a position you're in. If you're president or prime minister, you have more agency than yours truly. But nonetheless, these circumstances, there's a historical context of what's created certain economic structures of quality, inequality, or whatever the case might be. So economic structures, social structures, political structures, and we are constantly working with these structures and reproducing them or changing them. But we can never escape it. We're born into a particular structure, and hence I refer to great thinkers like Roy Bashka, Tony Giddens, who've taken this further, this thinking of the structure agency question. But it's the historical, political, economic context that shapes us, and we are shaped, and we can reshape it. And it's this structure agency dialect, but we're not entirely powerful because of the structure. But this is where critical theory comes in and talks about how agents can actually transform the structure under certain circumstances. So it's a much more, accordingly, it's a much more extensive way than just looking at the liberal notion of self-interested entities trying to achieve their interests and cooperate, and realist power politics, anarchical system trying to achieve security, survive, and security, and develop from there. It's trying to actually shape who we are as people and how we can do things better, etc., etc. So, capitalism. Yes, it's sold in the marketplace, but again, capitalism itself is a very specific historical social construct, although we're not talking about constructivism here, made, and it's a relationship and often tension, according to Marx, between capital, the capitalist, the owners of capital, and the wage labor, the laborer. And yes, Marx, and so if you look at the Communist Manifesto, it's overthrowing the owner of capital and having a classless society, a society where all can share resources, etc., etc. Again, Marx is critiqued because his idea of what this communism looked like was never especially well elaborated on. But his great contribution is his critique of capitalism. And so again, I re-emphasize this point that, look, there is a dynamic element that Karl Marx argues about capitalism being productive, dynamic, to all corners of the globe, what have you. But at the same time, it's disabling. It takes away agency. So contrary to liberals, it actually takes away the agency of the individual. Why? Because if you're in a powerful position, that's one thing. But if you're not, you're being exploited. And if you look at, let's say, a garment worker in Bangladesh or in Indonesia working for a multinational company, are they actually liberated, or are they being exploited? Liberals would say, well, actually, it's producing a wage, a salary, and helping people get out of poverty. So there's always a tension and disagreement, but it's arguably exploitative. Why is there such, according to Marx and Marxist thinkers, exploitative? And it's undemocratic. So when we think of democracy, liberal democracy, we think of political and civil institutions, so negative liberties. What about economic democracy? Especially if you look at, let's say, someone like Jeff Bezos, head of Amazon, making sometimes billions in the space of a week or months. But I don't want to exaggerate. I'm just referring to a newspaper article I've just read. But the point is, why is it, let's say, that some particular either individuals or companies are so powerful, and how does this actually help? More powerful than in some cases countries in terms of economics and what they make each year. But is it actually democratic? Does it produce a more democratic order? Why is there such inequality? And again, not just between the developed and developing countries, but even in the developed country, economically speaking, there can be real poverty. I don't want to say great poverty, that's perhaps an exaggeration, but there is poverty and there's inequalities. And this is another thing when we think of democracy, according to a Marxist reading, you need to think of it in a more expansive way. It's not just political and civil. Democracy is also, if there's great inequalities between peoples, why is that the case? Is that just? If not, no, why not? And how do we change it? Critical theory. Okay, so a brief aspect of historical context. Vladimir Lenin, one of the most famous figures in political history of the particularly 20th century, head of the Soviet Union and Bolshevik Revolution, leader from 1917 to 1924, etc. Rosa Luxemburg, an important Marxist thinker. Liberals have one notion here, Marxists have another, of why, so imperialism. So again, the European powers that I've referred to previously and in the last presentation, theorists of imperialism argue that capitalist accumulation, so wanting to get resources, get more and more, not just within our own societies and systems, but also from others. So if you're Britain in India, or in parts of East Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, if you're France, obviously also in West Africa, parts of Southeast Asia like Vietnam, and then I could go on with a whole host of different countries. But the point is, and their argument is that this colonial expansion between whether the British Empire, the French Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, previously, of course, the Spanish and Portuguese, Austro-Hungarian, whatever the case might be, there's a competition, and this competition is spread to different parts of the globe, and it's this tension and that creates a rivalry, and this is a structuralist fact. It becomes economically determined that there's going to be a fight. So it's more structuralist, not so much agency, more structuralist approach. Why? Because it's economics that shape outcomes. So accordingly, they would predict, or did predict, or make prediction that, or make the argument post hoc that actually the First World War took place. Why? Because of this expansion aspect from each of the imperial powers and how they came to conflict over, let's say, certain markets in other parts of the world. And this is early 20th century key thinkers. And here you can see, I just want to put this to one side. You can see on the bottom part, the world colonial empires. This is a rule of thumb image, so no image is necessarily perfect, but just to give you a rule of thumb, you can see the United States, its influence. You can see the German Empire. Okay, and then you can see more expansively, you can see the British Empire in different parts of the world, because Britain at this stage was the world's superpower, with a rising German Empire that was starting to have parts of Africa after the 1881 Berlin Conference. You see the French, parts of West Africa and so on, Indochina. You see the Belgians in Central Africa, Belgium, Congo, Italy, at this stage starting also to try to accumulate territories. Netherlands, Portugal and Spain, not so powerful anymore, but previously, historically, of course, the Americas, Latin America, and the United States, an increasing power. And at this stage, you had a rising United States, obviously, as we can now see, Germany as well, and leading, of course, eventually to the First World War and the horrors and destruction also of the Second World War, and the rise in Japan. And these different empires conflicting with each other, according to Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg and others, leading inevitably to actually conflict in the First World War. And this is what's known as the emphasis on the base, from a Marxist perspective, that colonialism or imperialism is inherently conflictual. Why? Because there's this aspect of capitalism that is expansion, and it's where empires fight with each other's. Later on, it might be multinational companies, not just nation states, but historically it was the state, which obviously supported a range of companies. So in the case of the UK, supporting the East Indian Company, and a relationship between the state and capitalism. So now this is important, and I want you to remember this. So for structural Marxism, a key thinker, there's also dependency theory, how developing countries are dependent on being invested in by developed countries. But this, I'm not going to talk about dependency theory, I'm talking about another theory which is similar, but different in its own way, is world systems theory, Immanuel Wallerstein. Late 1960s, early 1970s, Immanuel Wallerstein of Yale University, he actually differentiated hierarchically. So he said, contra a realist thing of an anarchical system, there's a hierarchy within the international system between core countries. So core countries, you can see, forgive me, I'm just going to show you shortly the core countries, and you can see here the wealthiest countries in Europe, North America, so United States, Canada, Australia. Semi-periphery, this is not an exact map of it, but let's say Russia, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, China, whole host of East European countries. Again, it's not exactly Turkey, not exactly and then green for many parts of North and Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, the Andes, Southeast Asia, parts of Southwest Asia. Again, not entirely accurate, but it should give you an indication that there's the wealthiest countries, the in-between, the so core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And semi-periphery are those that adjudicate the world economy with their resources, like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, historically, etc., Brazil. And the periphery, those that are largely speaking outside the global economy, or at least play a very minimal role and are exploited for those resources that it does have, etc. Now, I go back an image, so it's to here, and I want to show you now the differences. So Wallerstein makes it hierarchical, remember that. So between world systems theory, WST, core, semi-periphery, periphery. So core countries, again, various European, so West European, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, etc. They have, look at these features, conditions: advanced economic activities, democratic government and governance, high wages, broadly speaking. They import, what do they import? Raw materials from the semi-periphery countries, and they export manufacturing and increasingly high technology. And this depends on the type of capitalist system we're talking about and country, because Germany or Japan is different to the US. Well, they're each different to each other. But a high investment in welfare services and infrastructure, obviously maybe less so in some countries than others, but this is a general rule of thumb. So these factors are what make up the core countries. The semi-periphery, and historically some of these countries that became known as semi-periphery were Brazil, Turkey, India, China. Of course, you can change, but it's difficult in this structure. But there are examples of countries that have changed, but it's very structuralist, so it's largely being determined. But these countries have a mixture of production activities, semi-authoritarian governments, maybe authoritarian is too strong, but this is the terminology used by Wallerstein. They export raw materials and manufacturing. So oil-producing companies and countries, although companies, as we know, are very powerful here, and they import technology, and they low wages, low welfare activities, and they are the mediators of the world economy. So producing natural resources like oil and gas diamond, gold. These countries play a role which are needed by the developed countries, the core countries, and there's a relationship and a tension because the core countries are more powerful than the semi-periphery, but the semi-periphery are dependent on the core. So what's known as dependency in Latin America, Wallerstein is also talking about dependence. Hence, that's why they have this relationship and this exploitation. Finally, you have periphery. And again, if one thinks of certain parts of the world, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Andes, maybe Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, not all, some parts perhaps of South Asia, etc., etc. Really not part of the global economy and therefore either exploited or left out. Lack of technology, unstable governance and governments, poor education, infrastructure and health systems. That's what the IMF and the World Bank, the World Bank here in particular, emphasize, is these things of education and infrastructure, health systems. Although the Marxist approach would be critical of the IMF and World Bank sometimes for also supporting the most powerful countries and so on, and investors rather than the people on the ground. But export raw materials and cheap labor and weak state institutions. And this is important, this is periphery. And these countries are exploited by the core and in some cases by the semi-periphery, but they need the core and they need the semi-periphery to actually help and to, otherwise they are left out and otherwise they're re-immersed in great poverty. But again, there is a hierarchical structuralist approach. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that because it's structuralist, it's largely speaking deterministic. So the structure determines what takes place. There's little agency. And that's something that constructivists like Wendt have critiqued. And we'll look later on at critical theory of how social movements and other actors can play a role. But nonetheless, the structure is in place. Now, it's not the case that all countries stay in the same part, and you can go up or go down, so to speak. South Korea, for example, is a good example. After the Second World War, it was one of the poorest countries on this earth, poorer than India, poorer than parts of countries in West Africa. Now it would be in the core country, whether we talk G10 or G20, what have you. It's for a whole host of reasons. State-controlled capitalism, and then subsequently how it's developed from authoritarianism to democracy in the 1980s. But you can see some countries can leave periphery or semi-periphery and go to core or even go down. But broadly speaking, this is why there's inequality in the world, especially in this case, not so much between peoples, you might say, although people's societies are a part of this, but between states as well, according to world systems theory. And there's this dependence that stays in place. And this is structural Marxism, and this is, and bear this in mind because I'm going to be going into critical theory very soon. So base and superstructure, again from Das Kapital and Karl Marx. So the social, we have to think of things holistically, the way Aristotle did and other great thinkers, Marx here too, the totality, how everything's interconnected, intertwined, but not according to the way the liberal notion of, let's say, self-interest, but actually holism, how it's interconnected, and there's different elements of how things are interconnected, and we are being shaped and also shaping different aspects. Now, there's a relationship, and it's dialectical, between the base. Now, the base is the means and relations of production. Okay, so what are our types of production that one could do, and the relations between the capitalist, the owner of the capital, and the workers, whatever the case might be. This is what's known as the base, and it's economics. And later Marx, it's like how economics determines everything, which is sometimes an argument made, also in international relations. On the other hand, you have what's called the superstructure, which is, as I've spoken about before, you have the political, legal, educational, media aspects. So it's ideas, culture, norms. These are also playing a role in institutions that create or recreate inequalities, whatever the case. And it's a relationship between the two that critical theorists have a particular interest in. Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, in his way, Edward Said, I refer to, the major post-colonial thinker, and others. The relationship between the two, and some critical feminist thinkers too, emphasize this, like Cynthia Enloe, who I'm going to be talking about in the next set of slides. But the superstructure is important because beginning of the early 20th century, you have the Frankfurt School and Antonio Gramsci trying to understand, why does capitalism continue to be dynamic and reproduce itself? A revolution takes place, Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, but still capitalism in Western Europe still goes somewhat strong. Okay, you have the rising of fascism and a critique of it from a critical theory or Marxist point of view, but nonetheless, capitalism, as you can see going into the 20th century, post-Second World War, continues to reproduce it. So we have to understand the role of media, education, political institutions, how they socialize us to actually believe in a particular socio-economic order. Advertising, marketing, public relations in the 20th century plays this role. So someone like Noam Chomsky, who you've probably read or know about, Noam Chomsky, he looks at how we manufacture consent, a very interesting documentary, and elites do that to reproduce a particular social or political or economic order that they are interested in and have certain objectives with. It's not, of course, a conspiracy theory, because actually elites can also be conflictual with themselves, amongst themselves, but broadly speaking, elites, and it's not so pluralistic now, elites are largely speaking going to want to achieve certain self-interest for themselves, and it's through, let's say, education, media, and other, let's say, institutions that this takes place. So the superstructure is as important as the base, according to critical theorists. Now, so Antonio Gramsci, a Sardinian thinker who was imprisoned by the Mussolini's fascist government regime, he said, look, we have to consider much more the superstructure, as I emphasized in that last slide. And we'll see the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, later on Habermas, etc. So in particular, he's looking at, look, we have to think of the processes. So there's this idea of a centaur, so half man, half beast. Yes, there can be this realist thing of power politics, I can coerce you, but it can also be consent. And that's what Joseph Nye, the great liberal thinker here, IR thinker, soft power, and how you can actually, not just through coercion, but also through attraction. That's a liberal notion as well, but from Gramsci, it's critical of let's say the status quo. Why? Because the liberal aspect, according to Gramscian perspective, is still reproducing a particular status quo, an order where there are political and economic and social elites that in a sense are not benefiting all but a smaller percentage rather than a larger percentage, so to speak. And we want to emancipate everyone, so to speak. So we have to look at how we get consent. And again, Noam Chomsky is a very important thinker of the late 20th, not just for linguistics and the implications of all his great work there, but in terms of politics and US foreign policy, looking at why certain political and social orders are produced, and it's through hegemony. And hegemony is not what the realists or liberals talk about, this materialistic point of view, but it's actually through, let's say, beliefs and ideas that the elites have themselves like imparted, and where it's sort of like this process where after a while we take things for granted. So the role of public relations and other factors reproduce a particular order. If we don't question what capitalism is for, why it is what it is, then actually it has a certain power in place. Now, hegemony, it's those, so again, the ruling elite of a society, like their ideas, their ideologies are prevailed, and it needs to be, though, for it to be legitimized, it needs to be done through different groups in a society. So you need to get not just the elites right at the top, but also a whole stratum of, let's say, managers, different groups who actually agree and accept it, and therefore widely distribute it. And there's lots of different groups, civil society groups that, let's say, will promote it, different groups, and eventually it becomes accepted that this is the way our society is and this is where it should be. But according to a Gramscian notion, this is problematic because it reproduces a particular unequal order. Now, Gramsci was not writing about international relations. So here I'm going to bring in a very important Canadian scholar, Robert W. Cox, and his work, and his great work, 1981, his work that we should look at critical theory. But he wants to internationalize, so bring in the international element of Gramsci's work, and his work in Millennium, this article that I'm referring to, he wants to internationalize Gramsci's thought and think of how we use hegemony in a global context. And he wants to challenge the status quo and understand where historical and social forces have led us, where institutions are evolving, what we can do, so different social actors we can do to challenge, let's say, certain inequalities, how we can reform or change or move or possibly overthrow in the most extreme case, how we can change things to make a better world for all, so to speak. And critical theory, and here again, Frankfurt School, great German left-leaning thinkers like Horkheimer, Adorno, and others went to California, a part of their careers. Later on, Habermas, etc. Antonio Gramsci, Edward Said, who's sometimes put in this category as a post-colonial thinker as well. You come across also in cultural studies and so on. IR, these are the Frankfurt School also trying to understand, why is capitalism reproduced itself? Well, again, this is where, let's say, advertising, marketing, and other factors, this is the power of capitalism, that manufacturing certain needs, consent. For example, the certain clothing or perfume or aspects that let's say, of course, we need things and we need things to survive, but advertising companies and how they do it, and in a sense get us obsessed with let's say certain objects and material goods. This is the power of capital and capitalism. And it's the ideas and cultural factors at least as much as the economics. So again, the superstructure as much as the base and the relationship. In IR, Robert W. Cox is someone who's very influenced by Gramsci, and I'll be referring more to Robert W. Cox as this presentation evolves. And then I want to just refer to Ken Booth and Andrew Linklater, two very important thinkers, bringing normative elements, ethical elements to their thinking, who are also very influenced by the Frankfurt School and how things are and how they can be changed. Now, key elements of critical theory. And again, the superstructure as important as the base. Human nature is not fixed. Contra realists, it's socially conditioned under certain social, economic, political forces, and there's some agency with that. So a relationship between structure and agency. The environment is as important. So you might even hear some constructivist ideas from that we are socially conditioned and we are constantly interacting and trying to change. Knowledge is not neutral, as some realists and liberal institutionalists suggest, that actually you just fixate in a particular way. You observe certain things, the social world, the way you do the natural world. You observe it enough times, you make certain hypotheses, and you can say, this is the knowledge, this is it. Well, it depends. When we generate knowledge, when we look at things, so there are obviously in the social world researchers who do very important work, but the point is, often the type of research we look at and what we look at tends to put an emphasis on, according to critical theorists, I should say, on actually reinforcing particular, let's say, structures and inequalities, and actually who's doing the research, why are they funded, what's the context. These are questions one needs to ask. And we always have to therefore understand things within the context of interests. Interests are not neutral. There are different actors trying to achieve different outcomes. State actors, non-state actors. And again, in the social world, not so much the natural world, so brute facts, social facts, you may remember from constructivism, but our own values always play a role. So this is normative element, norms and normative. Again, you heard a bit from constructivism. Normative is what we should do in the English language, or ought to do, but this is where you bring in belief system, ethics, our values. So as researchers, so you're doing your research over the next 3 years in the Karlsruhe, and then later on doing a master's or working in public policy or some other area, you can't escape the fact that you might be male or female, come from a particular socioeconomic background, have been socialized in a particular way, and this is where we get into critical theory proper, with feminism, post-colonial, post-structuralism. So yes, we strive for objectivity in our research, and we ought to. Forgive me repeating the word ought, but it's very important. But still, we can't ever take away our values and our belief systems. And good researchers acknowledging our values and belief systems, but not becoming controlled by it and saying, okay, I research this so I understand from this perspective, and now I'm going to try to be objective from that. But we can't take our own belief systems and norms out of the equation, contra what positivists argue, some realists and liberal institutionalists. And again, knowledge and how we generate knowledge, particularly in the social context, we want to emancipate, we want to liberate people that they become educated, that they in a sense, to get out of Plato's notion of the cave. We want to, let's say, liberate people in their mindsets or their belief systems, and actually creating a better world order where there's less inequality, less suffering, etc., etc. So critical theory, again, a dialectical relationship between material and ideational factors, the base and the superstructure. We're looking at change. We're looking at holistically. We're looking at how the whole and the parts are all part of one, some sort of hologram, so to speak. And what can we do as social actors, not just political elites, but also social actors in society to play a role? Even in education, what can one do to educate, to work with, to facilitate people to think in a critical way about world order and how they can shape it in a critically engaged, skeptical way, but also creative way, and so on and so forth. So theory of history, we have to understand why institutions have evolved, where they've come from, why in the post-Second World War we have a particular order. We can go back further in time, why we're where we are, and what can we do right now? Why, when there are certain economic actors that are, let's say, more powerful now, state and non-state actors, how can that be changed, etc., etc. How can the developing world, the global south, also be part of the equation and actually be in a better position, etc., etc. So it questions the legitimacy of social and political institutions, whether in Germany, the UK, Nigeria, Brazil, Thailand, whatever the case might be. And we have to constantly be thinking, okay, we understand this, but there's actually this prevailing order. What can we do? What should we do in this? So when you see, let's say, protests after, let's say, the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis, what was the role of investment banks? How should they be reformed? How should they be regulated? And any other, let's say, event. And this is where you have social movements trying to change things, not always effectively being able to do it because there are political and economic and social interests. But what can one do? For example, if you take an institution like the IMF, in order, or the World Bank, these are important institutions, but the more powerful actors tend to be the G7 countries, or nowadays it's a bit more spread, a bit more democratic in inverted commas, maybe the G20. But there are countries like the US in particular, but also increasingly China, Japan, Germany, that are so much more powerful also in terms of their voting rights, let's say in the World Bank, than a smaller country. And also how they're represented in these different meetings. The same with the World Trade Organization. So in the case of the World Bank, an example, the United States has approximately, and you can look this up, 17.5% voting rights. And for something to go through, for it not to, it needs to get 85%. So the United States, one country can veto. If it doesn't like something the World Bank is doing, the United States representative can veto it. Now, Robert W. Cox, and this is a very important quotation that I want to give you from Robert W. Cox, and I'm going to read you out a longer quotation. But theory is always for someone and some purpose. No such thing as theory in itself. I'll read it a second time. Theory is always for someone and some purpose. No such thing as theory in itself. So particularly in the social world, he's referring to it. He's basically, what's he arguing here? He's saying that it's not neutral, the way positivists say, the way you can study the social world, the way you can the natural world, and you see patterns. No, there are interests, there are reasons why people do certain types of research in a particular area and theorize. So realists, for example, are comfortable with a particular order, as are liberals, this status quo approach. And this is we're going to get to problem solving shortly, more mainstream. And then you get constructivism, feminism, critical theory, post-structuralism, which tends to be put more in a critical theory capacity. But it's basically, again, for realists emphasizing the politico-military relationship, that is emphasized. Liberals focusing on economics, so for powerful companies and also political elites, it's better for a particular global order because of the interests involved. So Jürgen Habermas, later thinker of the Frankfurt School, still thankfully with us today, he looks at the emancipatory potential lying in the realm of communication, so communicative rationality. So getting people in the public sphere, influenced by Hannah Arendt in this sense, to have, let's say, interaction, to speak, to communicate, to actually try to create a more democratic institutions, not just political and civil, but also economic. And how do we do it? We do it through interaction, through social movements, through change, through dialogue, also with political elites to change, potentially to creating more progressive, ethically engaged societies and also international society. Now, Robert W. Cox, he differentiates between two different types of theory. There's the problem solving, and problem solving is more what realists and liberalism goes on about, and then the critical theory, which broadly speaking, constructivist, but and yes, certainly also feminist critical theory, post-structuralist anyway. So problem solving, and I just say this briefly, looks at how we can modify, change, let's say, modify the status quo to make it work a bit better. So realists about balance of power and but still this politico-military order that's happy with. Liberals, yes, we need to trade, we more interdependence, and over time it gets better. Critical theorists, and also all the theories I've just said, says the mainstream, and this is problematic in and of itself. And actually, if we want to change things for the better, but properly change things for the better in an emancipatory way, we need to do it much better and much more. So here I will now quote directly from Cox. Critical theory, as I understand it, is critical in the sense that it stands apart from the prevailing order and asks how that world came about. It does not just accept it. A world that exists has been made, and in the context of a weakening historical structure, it can be made anew. Critical theory, unlike problem-solving theory, does not take institutions and social power relations for granted, but calls them into questioning by concerning itself with their origins and whether and how they might be in process of changing. So beautifully written as well. So again, if we go back to that Marx quotation I said early on in this presentation, you can see the structure agency aspect, that there are, let's say, needing to stand outside the current political, social, economic order. How has it evolved? How has it come by historically? Asking difficult questions. How can we change it? Whether politicians or social movements or different actors, different stakeholders in society. Can we change it? And if so, how? Trying to understand the institutions, the global order that we have now. The global order arguably is changing as we speak. And what role can we play today, 2020, to change it in a more, let's say, ethical or progressive direction, and so on and so forth. And so these power relations, yes, they're there, but we shouldn't take them for granted. There you see a bit of influence from constructivism or connection. But we have to consider their origins and whether and how they might be in the process of changing. So power, if we want to understand power, it's not all well just saying, imagine there's no heaven, John Lennon or something, and great artist. It's great to be idealistic and think about it, but we also have to think, and here I'm not just referring to John Lennon, who had a critical mind in his own way, but basically, I want to say that we have to understand institutions, we have to understand the history of it. How has the IMF evolved? How has the World Bank evolved? Etc. And can we reform them? Can we actually have more voting rights for developing countries? How can they collaborate? How can social movements play a role in aspects of climate change and economic inequality and so on and so forth? And what role can we do to change it? What about BRICS? Does that, let's say, democratize global governance? These are important questions that we have to consider in a critical way to see how and in what way we have to understand how institutions have evolved and how we can shape them potentially for the future. But just saying I want to make the world to be nice or better is not good enough. We have to think how they've evolved, the institutions, and what we can do to change them. And in some cases overthrow them or reformed, whatever the case might be, and how it needs to be done. So, and these are questions and a guide for action according to critical theorists. So Mark Rupert's another important thinker in IR theory. So how has the world order come about? And the world order arguably today is changing. Are we going to have a more polymorphic world where power is much more dissipated? Or is it going to be China? Or is it going to be bipolar, the US and China? Is it going to be more non-state actors, the power of not multinational corporations? What about social movements and their role? How has the world order come about? Where is it going? So if we look at, let's say, Napoleonic, post-Napoleonic world order, different to the post-Second World War, and we could go further back in history, of course, and we want to look at how process changes both within the whole, but also its parts. So this hologram, this holistic approach, and the relationship that it's made up with. So we are elements of it, something that we're a part of, and we are shaping and being shaped by the whole, and so on. And we are trying to change it for better or worse. So we have to look at how history, and we have to be historically sensitive that there is change and potential transformation. And we have to challenge certain social and political institutions. Why is it, let's say, that this particular institution where there's inequality, why is it we have to accept it and live with it? So again, different social movements trying to change things, not always successfully because there are political and social and economic interests, but trying to understand. And this normative element. So how do we understand, what should we do? What ought we to do in looking at and trying to change things? And hegemony, or the Greek term hegemonia, contra, let's say, the realist notion of it and liberal in terms of hegemonic stability theory, this is the Gramscian or critical theory aspect that we have to consider and critique hegemony to try and have a order, social political order, internationally speaking, that we are that's more progressive or potentially emancipatory. But this is hegemony according to the Gramscian notion, critical theory. The ability of a dominant class, socio-economic, cultural even, socio-economic class. So the ability of a dominant class to exercise power by winning the consent of those it subjugates as an alternative to the use of coercion. So it's a socialization process. It's not just economics, it's socialization. So Pierre Bourdieu's work is very important here. A cultural or ideological process that operates through the dissemination of bourgeois values and beliefs throughout society. So to use a Marxist language, bourgeois, the middle class, they internalize it, believe in it, petit bourgeois too, and then it's spread, and therefore we are all socialized to believe and think in a certain way. And this is what needs to be thought about, challenged, critically engaged with, and so on. A case study that I want you to think about, and in class we can talk about, is the Arab Spring. I referred to in the United Nations presentation about the Libya, but early 2000. So I've referred a bit already to the Arab Spring, but it's how these, let's say, whether more secular or more religious societies in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa region, MENA, how different groups and members of society try to change things in the Middle East. So living under authoritarian rule, some cases, of course, supported by Western countries like the US, the UK, France, Germany, etc. But we want to overthrow some of these authoritarian regimes and have something that's really better for young people, but not just for young people, for all different groups in a society. And yes, we have to think about what was the, let's say, Western governments, for want of a better term, the US, the UK and others, their own role in supporting and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, and these, let's say, different social movements trying to have change, trying to put it, and so not just through Facebook, but also on the ground, grassroots, but social media obviously playing an important role here. We have to think, what was the Arab Spring? What were the successes or the failures? I mean, if you look at Yemen or Syria, the great tragedies, or in the case of Tunisia, maybe a more positive example, was it really a spring? Did it really bloom into, let's say, democracies and more freedoms in the Middle East and North African region, MENA region? Not necessarily, but this is what I want you to think about. Critical theory is important here because you have different groups in a society trying to change things. And it's not the case that authoritarian societies have to exist ad infinitum forever. There is a chance of change, and liberals would explain it one way, critical theorists would explain it in the way that actually social movements and different groups can actually play a role. Liberals would also say that, but actually you do need elites to play a role. In the case of critical theory, yes, elites can play a role, but often elites can be part of the problem, not the solution. And therefore there needs to be a progressive element within a society to change. Now, class question. One or both, one or the other you would choose. So how would a Marxist perspective explain US foreign policy in the Middle East? How would a Marxist perspective explain US foreign policy in the Middle East? And you could look at this in the post-Second World War context, the US relationship with Saudi Arabia, other Gulf oil-producing countries, and so on and so forth. The Iraq War 2003, perhaps. Think of it how a Marxist would explain this. So again, think of theory explaining the case, issue areas, or you can answer the question of Robert W. Cox's distinction. Do you agree with Cox's distinction between problem-solving theory on the one hand, realism, liberalism, and critical theory on the other hand. Do you agree with the distinction? Why do you agree if you agree? Why do you disagree if you don't agree? And so on and so forth. And there'll be further questions that you'll be doing for homework and we'll be engaging with, and thinking about and analysing. So again, thank you so much for your attention and see you very soon in class. Cheers. Bye-bye.